Hello mga ka-learners! So in the previous lesson, you learned to analyze the feeling of characters in a story. After learning how the characters in a particular story express their ideas and feelings, you will now be given a chance to express your own ideas and feelings after reading a story or other forms of literature. In this lesson, we will describe ideas and feelings about selections read clearly. This time, after reading a text or any form of literature or story, you will now express how you feel. Let's start with a poem entitled "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" by Dylan Thomas. This is a classic. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. They do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That poem gets me every time. How did you feel after reading the poem? The poem talks about dying. It tells us that we should not be afraid of dying, but we should do everything we could to strive to live despite difficulties. It gives us hope, actually, in dealing with the difficulties in life. After reading it, I felt encouraged to go on with life as well as I could. If you felt a bit sad but hopeful after reading the poem, then you are off to a great start. Let's now try to analyze and see how a reader will feel after reading the following short story. This is entitled "The Last Judgment" by Carol Capek. The notorious multiple killer Kugler, pursued by several warrants and a whole army of policemen and detectives, swore that he'd never be taken. He wasn't either, at least not alive. The last of his 9 murderous deeds was shooting a policeman who tried to arrest him. The policeman indeed died, but not before putting a total of 7 bullets into Kugler. Of these 7, 3 were fatal. Kugler's death came so quickly that he felt no pain, and so it seemed Kugler had escaped earthly justice. When his soul left his body, it should have been surprised at the sight of the next world. A world beyond space, gray and infinitely desolate. But it wasn't. A man who has been jailed on 2 continents looks upon the next life merely as new surroundings. Kugler expected to struggle through, equipped only with a bit of courage as he had in the last world. At length, the inevitable last judgment got around to Kugler. Heaven being eternally in a state of emergency, Kugler was brought before a special court of 3 judges and not, as his previous conduct would ordinarily merit, before a jury. The courtroom was furnished simply, almost like courtrooms on earth, with this one exception. There was no provision for swearing in witnesses. In time, however, the reason for this will become apparent. The judges were old and worthy counselors with austere, bored faces. Kugler complied with the usual tedious formalities. Ferdinand Kugler, unemployed, born on such and such a date, died. At this point, it was shown Kugler didn't know the date of his own death. Immediately he realized this was a damaging omission in the eyes of the judges. His spirit of helpfulness faded. "Do you plead guilty or not guilty?" asked the presiding judge. "Not guilty," said Kugler obdurately. "Bring in the first witness," the judge sighed. Opposite Kugler appeared an extraordinary gentleman, stately, bearded, and clothed in a blue robe strewn with golden stars. At his entrance, the judges arose. Even Kugler stood up, reluctant but fascinated. Only when the old gentleman took a seat did the judges again sit down. "Witness," began the presiding judge. "Omniscient God, this court has summoned you in order to hear your testimony in the case against Kugler Ferdinand. As you are the supreme truth, you need not take the oath. In the interest of the proceedings, however, we ask you to keep to the subject at hand rather than branch out into particulars, unless they have a bearing on this case. And you, Kugler, don't interrupt the witness. He knows everything, so there's no use denying anything. And now, witness, if you would please begin." That said, the presiding judge took off his spectacles and leaned comfortably on the bench before him, evidently in preparation for a long speech by the witness. The oldest of the three judges nestled down in sleep. The recording angel opened the book of life. God, the witness, coughed lightly and began. "Yes, Kugler Ferdinand, Ferdinand Kugler, son of a factory worker, was a bad, unmanageable child from his earliest days. He loved his mother dearly, but was unable to show it. This made him unruly and defiant. Young man, you irked everyone. Do you remember how you bit your father on the thumb when he tried to spank you? You had stolen a rose from the notary's garden." "The rose was for Irma, the tax collector's daughter," Kugler said. "I know," said God. "Irma was 7 years old at that time. Did you ever hear what happened to her?" "No, I didn't." "She married Oscar, the son of the factory owner, but she contracted a venereal disease from him and died of a miscarriage. You remember Rudy Zaruba? What happened to him?" "Why, he joined the Navy and died accidentally in Bombay. You two were the worst boys in the whole town. Kugler Ferdinand was a thief before his 10th year and an inveterate liar. He kept bad company too. Old Gribble, for instance, a drunkard and an idler, living on handouts. Nevertheless, Kugler shared many of his own meals with Gribble." The presiding judge motioned with his hand as if much of this was perhaps unnecessary. But Kugler himself asked hesitantly, "And what happened to his daughter?" "Mary?" asked God. "She lowered herself considerably. In her 14th year, she married. In her 20th year, she died, remembering you and the agony of her death. By your 14th year, you were nearly a drunkard yourself, and you often ran away from home. Your father's death came about from grief and worry. Your mother's eyes faded from crying. You brought dishonor to your home, and your sister, your pretty sister Martha, never married. No young man would come calling at the home of a thief. She's still living alone and in poverty, sewing until late each night. Scrimping has exhausted her, and patronizing customers hurt her pride. What's she doing right now?" "This very minute, she's buying thread at Wolf's. Do you remember that shop? Once when you were 6 years old, you bought a colored glass marble there. On that very same day, you lost it and never found it. Do you remember how you cried with rage?" "Whatever happened to it?" Kugler asked eagerly. "Well, it rolled into the drain and under the gutter spout. Right now, it's still there, after 30 years. Right now, it's raining on earth and your marble is shivering in the gush of cold water." Kugler bent his head, overcome by this revelation. But the presiding judge fitted his spectacles back on his nose and said mildly, "Witness, we are obliged to get on with the case. Has the accused committed murder?" Here the witness nodded his head. "He murdered 9 people. The first one he killed in a brawl, and it was during his prison term for his crime that he became completely corrupted. The second victim was his unfaithful sweetheart. For that, he was sentenced to death, but he escaped. The third was an old man whom he robbed. The fourth was a night watchman." "Then he died?" Kugler asked. "He died after 3 days in terrible pain," God said. "And he left 6 children behind him. The 5th and 6th victims were an old married couple. He killed them with an axe and found only $16, although they had $20,000 hidden away. Kugler jumped up. Where? In the straw mattress, God said. In a linen sack inside the mattress. That's where they hid all the money they acquired from greed and penny pinching. The seventh man he killed in America, a countryman of his, a bewildered, friendless immigrant. So it was in the mattress? Whispered Kugler in amazement. Yes, continued God. The eighth man was merely a passerby who happened to be in Kugler's way when Kugler was trying to outrun the police. At that time, Kugler had periosteitis and was delirious from the pain. Young man, you were suffering terribly. The ninth and last was the policeman who killed Kugler exactly when Kugler shot him. And why did the accused commit murder? Asked the presiding judge. For the same reasons others have, answered God. Out of anger or desire for money, both deliberately and accidentally, some with pleasure, others from necessity. However, he was generous and often helpful. He was kind to women, gentle with animals, and kept his word. Am I to mention his good deeds? Thank you, said the presiding judge, but it isn't necessary. Does the accused have anything to say in his own defense? No, Kugler replied with honest indifference. The judges of this court will now take this matter under advisement, declared the presiding judge, and the three of them withdrew. Only God and Kugler remained in the courtroom. Who are they? Asked Kugler, indicating with his head the men who just left. People like you, answered God. They were judges on earth, so they're judges here as well. Kugler nibbled his fingertips. I never really thought about it, but I figured you would judge since I'm God, finished the stately gentleman. But that's just it, don't you see? Because I know everything, I can't possibly judge. That wouldn't do at all. By the way, do you know who turned you in this time? No, I don't, said Kugler, surprised. Lucky the waitress. She did it out of jealousy. Excuse me? Kugler ventured. But you forgot about that good-for-nothing Teddy I shot in Chicago. Not at all, God said. He recovered and is alive this very minute. I know he's an informer, but otherwise he's a very good man and terribly fond of children. You shouldn't think of any person as being completely worthless. But I still don't understand why you aren't the judge, Kugler said thoughtfully. Because my knowledge is infinite. If judges knew everything, absolutely everything, then they would also understand everything. Their hearts would ache. They couldn't sit in judgment, and neither can I. As it is, they only know about your crimes. I know all about you, the entire Kugler, and that's why I cannot judge. But why are they judging the same people who were judges on earth? Because man belongs to man. As you see, I'm only the witness, but the verdict is determined by man, even in heaven. Believe me, Kugler, this is the way it should be. Man isn't worthy of divine judgment. He deserves to be judged only by other men. At that moment, the three returned from their deliberation. In heavy tones, the presiding judge announced, for repeated crimes of first-degree murder, manslaughter, robbery, disrespect for the law, illegally carrying weapons, and for the theft of a rose, Kugler Ferdinand is sentenced to lifelong punishment in hell. Next case, please. Torrance Frank. Is the accused present in court? How does the story make you feel? The story presented gives us an insight on what is likely to happen to us after we die. It tells us about the experience of a man named Ferdinand Kugler and how he paid for all his sins even after his death. Even if he didn't suffer for all the things he'd done while he was still living, he wasn't able to escape the consequences of his deeds when he died. The story proved the saying, "You reap what you sow." Reading a story like this really gives us something to think about afterward. It helps us realize that we should always do good to others unless we want to suffer the consequences of our actions. it helps us realize that we should always think of the possible consequences of all of our actions first before we actually do something. After all, we will not be only responsible for them while we are still alive, we'll still be responsible for them after our death. Let's summarize what we have learned so far. Always be honest and sincere whenever expressing your ideas and feelings. You should also use the appropriate words when doing so that there would be no misunderstanding and confusion. This is the end of the module. Congratulations for finishing it. Did you like it? Did you learn anything useful from it? I hope you learned about how to describe the feelings of characters in a text, as well as also describing how you feel after reading a text. Once you appreciate the skill, it can open your eyes to the joy of reading. Kung gusto nyo ulitin yung mga storya at ibang babasahin dito, ay mahahanap ninyo sa online account ninyo. And I will see you next time, mga ka-learners!